What if I told you that King Arthur wasn't just a legend, but a real warrior whose true identity has been hiding in plain sight for over 1,500 years? The evidence is about to blow your mind. For centuries, historians have debated whether the legendary King Arthur actually existed. While most dismiss him as pure fantasy, a growing body of evidence suggests that Arthur was based on a real historical figure, or possibly several figures whose stories merged into one epic tale. Today, we're diving deep into 6 historical candidates who could be the real Arthur, and by the end of this video, you'll know which one has the strongest claim to Camelot's throne. Why Arthur matters. The legend of King Arthur emerged during one of Britain's darkest periods. After the Romans abandoned Britain in 410 AD, the island descended into chaos. Saxon invaders poured in from the east, Celtic kingdoms fragmented, and civilization itself seemed to be crumbling. It was during this turbulent time that the Britons desperately needed a hero, someone who could unite the warring tribes and push back the Saxon tide. This is where our story begins, not in the fantasy realm of medieval romance, but in the brutal reality of post-Roman Britain. The Roman general. Our first candidate is Ambrosius Aurelianus, a Romano-British war leader mentioned by the historian Gildas in the 6th century. Unlike the later medieval Arthur, Ambrosius was undeniably real. Gildas describes him as a man of Roman heritage who rallied the Britons against Saxon invaders around 460 to 470 AD. What makes Ambrosius fascinating is his background. He was reportedly the last of the Roman nobles in Britain, educated in Roman military tactics and possessing the organizational skills to unite scattered British forces. Historical records suggest he achieved significant victories against the Saxons, temporarily halting their westward advance. The connection to Arthur becomes clearer when you consider that later Welsh traditions often conflate the two figures. In some early texts, Arthur is described as Ambrosius's successor or even his nephew. Could the Arthur legend have grown from stories of this real Roman general who briefly restored hope to a dying civilization? The Forgotten King. Here's where things get really interesting. In 468 AD, a British king named Riothamus led an army of 12,000 men across the English Channel to fight alongside the Romans in Gaul. This isn't legend. It's documented historical fact, recorded by multiple Roman historians. Riothamus, whose name literally means Supreme King, controlled territories in both Britain and Brittany. He was betrayed by his Roman allies and disappeared from history after a battle near Avallon. A name that should sound familiar to anyone who knows Arthurian legend. The parallels are striking. A British king who fights in Gaul, suffers betrayal, and vanishes near a place called Avallon, which later traditions would transform into Avallon, Arthur's final resting place. Geoffrey Ashe, a respected Arthurian scholar, argues that Riothamus is the strongest candidate for the historical Arthur. The timeline fits perfectly. The geographical connections are solid. And unlike purely legendary figures, we have contemporary documentation of his existence, the Roman commander. Now, we venture into more controversial territory with Lucius Artorius Castus, a Roman cavalry commander who served in Britain during the 2nd century AD. What makes Castus intriguing isn't just his name, Artorius being the Latin form of Arthur, but his military career. Castus commanded Sarmatian cavalry units, warriors from the steppes, who fought with distinctive weapons and tactics that mirror descriptions in later Arthurian tales. The Sarmatians used heavy cavalry, fought with long swords, and carried dragon banners, all elements that would later appear in Arthur stories. Some researchers, including C. Scott Littleton and Linda Malcor, propose that stories of Castus and his Sarmatian warriors were preserved in military traditions and eventually evolved into Arthurian legend. The Round Table, they argue, could derive from Sarmatian customs of circular seating arrangements during military councils. However, Castus lived 3 centuries before the traditional Arthur period, making this connection more speculative than others. But here's the problem that has stumped historians for generations. None of these candidates perfectly matches the Arthur of legend. Each has compelling evidence, but also significant gaps. How do we separate historical fact from medieval embellishment? And what if the answer isn't finding one Arthur, but understanding how multiple historical figures merged into a single legendary king? The Welsh Prince. Deep in Welsh genealogies and ancient texts, we find Owain Ddantgwyn, a prince of Rhos who lived in the late 5th century. This candidate comes from the work of historian Chris Barber and linguist David Pikett, who argue that Arthur wasn't a name, but a title meaning bear-like or warrior. Owain ruled from Ddantgwyn, a fortress that commanded strategic importance in North Wales. Archaeological evidence from the site shows it was heavily fortified during the right time period and contained a great hall that could have inspired later descriptions of Camelot. More intriguingly, the area around Ddantgwyn contains numerous place names associated with Arthurian legend, suggesting local traditions preserved memories of a great king. The Welsh connection is crucial because the earliest Arthur stories come from Welsh literature, not English sources. The Mabinogion and other Welsh texts present Arthur as a warrior chief fighting both Saxon invaders and supernatural threats. A figure who fits perfectly with what we know about late 5th century Welsh princes. The forgotten King of Glamorgan, our 5th candidate, takes us to South Wales and the Kingdom of Glamorgan. Athrwys ap Meurig, according to genealogies preserved in medieval Welsh manuscripts, was a king who ruled Glamorgan in the late 5th and early 6th centuries. His name, when pronounced in Old Welsh, sounds remarkably similar to Arthur. What sets Athrwys apart is the wealth of circumstantial evidence surrounding him. His kingdom included territories later associated with Arthurian sites, including locations near modern Cardiff that medieval writers identified with Camelot. Archaeological excavations in the area have revealed extensive fortifications from the right time period, including what appears to have been a major royal center. Furthermore, genealogical records suggest Athrwys had connections throughout Britain. Exactly what you'd expect from a king powerful enough to unite the Britons against Saxon invaders. His descendants ruled various Welsh kingdoms for centuries, preserving family traditions that may have contributed to the Arthur legend. The composite theory, multiple Arthurs, our final candidate, isn't a single person, but a revolutionary theory. What if Arthur represents multiple historical figures whose stories merged over centuries of oral tradition? This composite theory suggests that the Arthur legend drew from several real warriors and kings who fought the Saxons during the 5th and 6th centuries. Elements of Ambrosius Aurelianus's Roman military prowess, Riothamus's continental adventures, various Welsh princes' territorial control, and local folk memories of successful battles against invaders all contributed to a growing legend. As these stories spread through Britain and Brittany, they naturally began to cluster around the most successful and memorable figures. Eventually, medieval writers like Geoffrey of Monmouth synthesized these diverse traditions into the coherent Arthur narrative we know today. But here's the revelation that changes everything. Recent archaeological discoveries are providing unprecedented insights into post-Roman Britain. Excavations at Tintagel in Cornwall have revealed a major 5th-6th century settlement with evidence of international trade and political importance. Radiocarbon dating confirms the site was active during the traditional Arthur period, and artifacts suggest it housed someone of considerable wealth and power. Similarly, excavations at Cadbury Castle in Somerset, long identified with Camelot, have uncovered massive fortifications built during the late 5th century. The scale of construction suggests resources and manpower that only a major king could command. These archaeological findings don't prove Arthur existed, but they demonstrate that the political and military conditions described in Arthurian legend were very real. Someone was indeed building great fortresses, organizing resistance against Saxon invaders, and commanding enough respect to unite fractious British kingdoms. After examining all 6 candidates, the evidence points toward a fascinating conclusion. Arthur likely existed, but not as a single individual. Instead, he represents the collective memory of several historical figures who successfully resisted Saxon expansion during Britain's darkest hour. The strongest individual candidate remains Riothamus, whose documented historical career most closely matches the legendary Arthur's achievements. However, the composite theory best explains how a relatively obscure 5th century king became the central figure of medieval romance. Oh, what's certain is that something extraordinary happened in post-Roman Britain. Despite overwhelming odds, British resistance slowed Saxon conquest for generations. Cities like Bath and Gloucester remained British until the 570s, nearly 2 centuries after the Romans left. Someone was organizing this resistance, achieving victories significant enough to echo through centuries of storytelling. The search for the historical Arthur reveals something more profound than any single answer could provide. Whether he was Riothamus leading armies in Gaul, Ambrosius rallying Romano-British forces, or a composite of multiple Welsh princes, Arthur represents the very real heroism of people who refuse to surrender in the face of overwhelming odds. The legend endures because it captures a fundamental truth. In Britain's darkest moment, when civilization itself hung in the balance, extraordinary leaders emerged to fight for their people's survival. Arthur may have been one man or many, but the courage and determination he represents were undeniably real. That's what makes the Arthur legend so powerful. It's rooted in the documented struggles of real people facing impossible circumstances and refusing to give up. In the end, perhaps that's more inspiring than any fantasy could ever be. The mysteries of ancient Britain don't end with Arthur. Discover the shocking truth about what really happened to the lost Roman legions in our next video. You won't believe what archaeologists just uncovered.